and welcome to the Kim Iverson Show. Thank you guys so much for joining us. So we have been going over all of the candidates. We've been talking to all of the presidential candidates who are running, and we've spoken to Jill Stein from the Green Party. We've spoken to Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who's now an independent. We've talked to, we've actually spoken to already three of the Libertarian candidates, and today we're going to be talking to a fourth. The Libertarian primary is probably the most interesting out of all of them because they actually have candidates and they actually have choices, right? With the Democratic Party, you've got Joe Biden. We've spoken to Marianne Williamson. I'm not sure where she's at in her campaign at this point. I know there's another person, I think Dean Phillips, who's running, and we're going to try to get him on the show and talk to him as well. But we all know what's going to happen with the Democratic primary. The Republican primary also not that interesting. We know that Donald Trump is going to be getting the nomination. Nikki Haley is still still trying, but I'm sure that's going to end after the South Carolina primary, which happens, I believe, in about 10 days. I think it's not this Saturday, but Saturday after. So the Libertarian Party is the most interesting. There's actual candidates. There's people competing with one another. And so today we're talking to the fourth large candidate for the Libertarian Party. I believe there's several who are running, but we've talked to the top. We're really kind of covering the top four, and today is the last of the top four. Mike Ter Maat is who we're talking to today. We're going to get into his campaign, his policy ideas, his vision for America, and I think it's a really interesting time to be a libertarian. I think a lot of people are more interested in libertarianism because they're very skeptical of the big government that seems to be ever expanding. You got surveillance and CBDCs and labeling everybody terrorists, and people are wanting to shy away from big government control. So I think it's a really interesting time to be a libertarian. Mike Ter Maat, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Kim. It's a great joy to be with you. It's good to see you again.
So you're running for president.
Someone
What?
has to do it, Kim.
Let's first, why would you choose to run for president? First of all, I mean, this is a big endeavor. You have to raise a lot of money. They might dig into your personal life. Things might get dirty. Like, what would compel you to do this?
None of that has happened, Kim. It's all been an absolute breeze and a great pleasure. The reason I am running, of course, I think we all recognize inside the Libertarian Party that we have a huge opportunity in 2024. But I also think that we have an obligation. I think that we have an obligation to get this right. And in my view, that means doing a couple of things that we haven't done perfectly right in the past. One is to run a very, very principled platform. I'm running it, as you know, on something I call a Gold New Deal. And the second thing I think that we need to get right is to run a very credible campaign, a very professional campaign. That's why we're building a big team, and that's why we leaned into my own background in public service and public policy.
Right, which we're going to get into. We're going to get to know you. Mike Ter Maat, who are you, what you stand for, what you're about, what this Gold New Deal is rather than a Green New Deal. There's a Gold New Deal that you present. Let's get into your background. Where are you from?
Well, I grew up outside of Chicago, went to school in New York, went to school in Washington, worked in New York, worked in Washington, spent a dozen years working as a police officer as a second career in Florida, spent 20 years altogether in Florida, and now back in Virginia, living out in the middle of eastern nowhere, as they say.
Okay, let's actually dive into that a bit deeper. So your education, because you have an interesting background. So you were where did you go to college? What did you get your degree in?
I studied engineering at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in lovely Troy, New York, which is actually lovelier than it was 2 generations ago when I was there. Studied engineering, later went to business school and got an MBA at RPI as well, and went to work for a couple of commercial banks, first in New York and then in New Jersey in the New York suburbs.
And then you went on and got another degree, didn't you?
And then I came to Washington. I went to the George Washington University and took a master's degree and a PhD in economics.
Okay.
And was lucky to be there. It was a very free market oriented program, so it put me in good stead.
So you have a PhD in economics.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so you're an economist, would you say?
I would.
Okay. After all of that education, why did you suddenly become a police officer in Florida? What happened
Well,
there?
it wasn't. I shouldn't say it was suddenly. After graduate school, I worked for the White House as an economist. I taught economics at a couple of different universities. I launched my own business. I was in the business of educating bankers and other financial services professionals. And I worked for almost a decade in Washington advocating for free markets and deregulation and greater competition. So it wasn't until later in life. I didn't go to the police academy until I was 49 years old.
Wow.
The majority of my classmates, we figured out one day, the majority of my classmates had at least one parent younger than I was. So it was definitely a second career and a move later in life. It was something I had always been interested in. I'm a big believer in public service and just put it off, put it off, put it off, in part because of financial reasons. And once you get to be 49 years old, I can tell you there is a feeling that if you don't get it done, it's not going to get done. I was healthy and in good shape, so it worked out well for me.
What an interesting decision to do. And as you mentioned, financially, I mean, you'd have to start back over. And cops, from what I understand, don't get paid very well.
No, and that's why I put it off. I was in a little bit different financial position at the age of 49 than I was at the age of 29.
Yeah.
And so putting it off for those 20 years gave me the opportunity to get the kids through college and some of
Okay.
those things that would be difficult on a police officer's salary.
Well, how interesting. What was that like when you became a cop? Like, what did you do? Did they first like stick you at a desk, or did they put you on traffic patrol? Like, what were you doing?
No, neither of those two things. You start out like everybody else. I was on the road. I stayed on the road for 11 and a half years. I never asked to leave the road. I really enjoyed it. I was lucky. I worked for a police department. I chose a police department that had a separate unit to take care of traffic and a separate unit that took care of the things that, as a libertarian, I viewed as dopey, the war on drugs and prostitution stings and things like that. So I didn't have to get involved with that. My job was bread and butter, fighting crime, responding to calls for service, patrol, and getting to know your community. Being a police officer is all about protecting property and life and protecting your rights. One of the things you'll learn as a cop is that you're the last defense of the Constitution. So if you don't take it seriously, there's no one out there who will for you.
And then why did you stop?
I stopped. I worked on the road for 11 and a half years. I was 60 years old. In that sense, I think that it was probably time to move along. I was running for Congress at the time. I started running for Congress in Florida's District 20 while still a cop, and retired in the middle of that campaign, giving myself some more time to campaign, and then rolled from that right into the presidential campaign. So it was
Okay.
good timing. I
So
can
you
tell you it would not be possible to run this campaign and work full time, much
right,
less as a police officer.
right, right. Yeah. So now you're on your potential third career now. That's what this would be. This transition.
I suppose you could call it that, yes.
Yeah, but you did work. You do have White House experience. What administration did you work for?
I worked for the George Herbert Walker Bush administration. I was career civil servant for a couple of years. So, he was my boss's 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 boss.
Yeah.
So it's not like we were having tea in the Oval Office every day. My job was to work on matters of the budget. In those days, we had something called budget control law. So it was all about making sure everyone understood what the parameters were against spending too much money. I sort of wish we had some of that law in effect today.
Yeah, what do you think's gone wrong with our I mean, now we're in a massive amount of debt. It just seems to be never ending. I mean, Congress just seems to continue raising the debt ceiling. They just continue to seem to spend more and more money. We now have $95 billion going to foreign countries rather than to American infrastructure and American homelessness and America in the border and all these types of things that we're dealing with here in the United States. What do you think has gone wrong
Keep
economically?
going. That's a good list. You're on
Yeah.
top of your game this morning. Politically, I think that we've gone off the rails. I think that you could easily argue that we live today, Kim, in a post-constitutional nation. we don't live in a nation truly of laws anymore when it comes to a number of areas, and spending is one of them. Congress no longer feels constrained in terms of the size and scope of the government per the Constitution. They spend whatever it is they think is politically motivated. And I would argue that we live in a different political environment than we did even a generation or two, even in my lifetime. It used to be that you could find a fiscally conservative Republican, not so much anymore. I think it's fair to say you used to be able to find an anti-war Democrat once in a while, and you don't see that anymore either.
Right.
Each party has given up on the agenda of the past and has adopted as its number one priority keeping the other side out of power. And of course, we know that's where authoritarianism comes from in a democracy, something that we never thought was possible in America. And now, not only is it possible, but it's here, it's growing, it's accelerating. And I think the parties just do nothing but whatever it takes to stay in power. And a big piece of that is spending money, your money, my money, and a lot of money that belongs to families that can least afford to have their resources taken from them. And to your point, all the worse, sent abroad all too often to support others' wars, to support our own wars, which is possibly even more disgusting, and to spread foreign aid around when we can least afford it.
As an economist, when you look at the amount of debt the United States is in, what's going to happen?
We don't talk enough about this, but I'm glad you brought this up. I do not believe it's reasonable to expect the U.S. federal government to survive past the middle of this century. And I think that there are any one of three different ways it can fail. A fiscal collapse, as you put your finger on, because there's so much debt. At some point, we just don't have the resources to keep servicing that debt. And the other two ways, and I make no prediction about which one of these three is likely to approach us first, but I do worry about our constant military interventionism eventually leading to another world war that would be difficult from which to extract ourselves. And I also worry that in another COVID regime-like disaster, I do worry about civil unrest raising its head in a much more broad, widespread fashion than we have seen in the past. And I worry that that is another type of disaster that could bring down the government eventually. Yeah. So I do worry a great deal, Kim.
Well, I mean, for sure, if we get into some serious economic hot water, which we very well might with this debt the way that it is, the government will start implementing. I mean, they'll start getting really desperate, right? So they will start wars, probably World War III, as a distraction. They will clamp down on our civil liberties. It might not be COVID, but it could be even the war itself, saying, "Okay, now we have to strip you of liberties because we're in war, and it's serious wartime, and we have to protect you." That's what the excuse was during COVID, right? We're protecting you. We're protecting your family members. We're protecting grandma. And
yeah,
in doing
less
so,
protection, please, right?
Right. Yeah. And then turning into an authoritarian regime in order to, during that time. And I think that would be the logical, just seeing how they've reacted in the past and knowing how they would probably react. I mean, that's what they would do. They're going to clamp down on us once the economy starts really collapsing. But how long do we have, do you think? I mean, this debt has just skyrocketed over the last.
Yeah, I agree. It's difficult to predict, but I don't think we've got more than a couple of decades at the outside, right? And I do worry that of those three disasters I describe, a civil liberties, civil unrest type of disaster, a world war, or a financial collapse, you put your finger on something very important. One can lead to the other, right? A war can lead to a fiscal collapse. A fiscal collapse can lead to a civil liberties clampdown. And of course, that can lead to a world war, and they can all go in the other direction as well. And so I worry that some combination of these three or any one of these three can trigger the others. In terms of how long we have to go, I do think it's very difficult to predict. But in the case of our military interventionism, Kim, what I worry about is that we are constantly at war now over the past several decades. And I worry that just based on statistics, at some point you're going to be in some sort of military intervention that's difficult to extract yourself from, and it gets out of hand.
Right.
At some point, we're not going to be as lucky as we have been up until now.